Even though I am not worried about the consequence argument, I am worried about Jaegwon Kim's exclusion argument against the possibility of mental causation. It's a deeper, logically prior problem than the free will and moral responsibility problems. Regarding free will and moral responsibility, the most fundamental issue is whether mental events can be causal at all. If not, then the conscious deliberations that we so treasure as the basis of both free will and moral responsibility are at best epiphenomenal. For example, a shadow can be made to look like it causes another shadow to move, but we all know that shadows cannot really be causal in this way. If mental events are similarly only apparently causal of their intended consequent actions, but not really causal of them, then there can be no mental causation and therefore also no free mental causation. Ruling out mental causation would rule out free will. Similarly, if a fundamental component of any definition of moral responsibility is that an act of willing causes consequences to happen for which we are in part blameworthy or praiseworthy, but willings cannot be causal because mental events cannot be causal, then moral responsibility is not possible either. No mental causation implies no free will and no moral blameworthiness either. The exclusion argument is a more devastating argument against compatibilism than the consequence argument, in my view. The exclusion argument is explicitly about causation, not implicitly so like the consequence argument. Let's walk through the exclusion argument. The exclusion argument rests on a premise of the causal closure of the physical. Causal closure means that causality at the level of particles is sufficient to account for all outcomes and interactions at the level of particles. Kim, applying Occam's razor, advocates the exclusion of overdetermination when modeling physical causation. In his words, if event E has a sufficient cause C at time t, no event at time t distinct from C can be a cause of E. If particle-level causality is sufficient to account for particle behavior, and neurons are made of particles, mental events, assuming that they are realized in or supervene upon neuronal and particle events, can play no causal role in neuronal or particle behavior. In other words, mental events cannot cause fundamental particles to behave differently than they otherwise would have behaved if they had only interacted according to the deterministic laws obeyed by particles. And the same goes for neural events. Put succinctly, Kim's exclusion argument can be stated as a logical syllogism. Major premise: all physical events are caused by preceding sufficient physical causes. In other words, all microphysical states are completely and sufficiently caused by antecedent microphysical states. Minor premise: mental events are realized in physical events. In other words, mental events are realized in and determined by underlying microphysical states. Conclusion: the physical events that realize mental events have preceding sufficient physical causes. In other words, mental events are not causal even if they appear to be, because particle-on-particle causation is a sufficient account of how events unfold. All causation boils down to particle-on-particle causation, which is a level where mental and moral descriptions simply don't apply. One way to try to skirt this would be to let go of mental causation and simply try to ground free will and moral responsibility solely on the neural basis of mental events. Someone making this philosophical move would redefine free will away from mental free will and the conscious deliberations that nearly everyone really hopes to find to be causal. The philosopher Al-Mili, for example, hedges his bets when he frames causation disjunctively by saying that a mental event such as an intention or its physical basis causes a decision and the consequences of acting on that decision. If the exclusion argument holds, however, a mental event cannot be causal, leaving open only the possibility that its physical basis is causal as a physical-on-physical event. That might be a way to save free will from the exclusion argument, but would come at the cost of accepting that mental events cause nothing. I think this move fails because the exclusion argument makes neural causation epiphenomenal as well, assuming determinism, since it also reduces to particle-on-particle causation. If we lose both mental causation and neural causation to the exclusion argument under determinism, we lose free will and moral responsibility utterly. I believe the exclusion argument holds if determinism is the case, ruling out mental causation and thereby mental free will and mental moral responsibility. If determinism is true, then the major premise is true because then events are sufficient causes of their subsequent outcomes, as Newton or Einstein believed. A physicalist like myself must accept the minor premise that mental events are entirely realized in their neural and ultimately particle-level basis. Thus, if determinism is true, Jaegwon Kim's brutal conclusion follows, namely that mental causation is not really causal at all, which in turn rules out the kind of mental free will and moral responsibility most people want. Therefore, free will and moral responsibility are not compatible with determinism. The exclusion argument is so deadly for compatibilism in its simplicity because it follows from widely held assumptions of reductionistic physicalism about mental realization and physical causation. For me, the big problem for a compatibilist position regarding free will is not the consequence argument, but rather Kim's exclusion argument. I believe it holds true if determinism is the case. No non-epiphenomenal mental causation entails no non-epiphenomenal free will. Can you think of a way that the exclusion argument would not hold in a deterministic universe? If not, then you, like me, will be forced into a position of incompatibilism. The exclusion argument is why I believe that free will is incompatible with determinism.